The Bitterroot Valley in western Montana is one of those rare places on Earth that seems almost too beautiful to be real. Cradled between the Bitterroot Range to the west and the Sapphire Mountains to the east, it stretches nearly 100 miles through a landscape of alpine meadows, cold water rivers, and soaring peaks that brush the edge of the sky. To drive through it for the first time is to understand why people speak of Montana with a reverence that other states simply do not inspire. And for Barbara Bolick, it was the place that transformed her entirely. Barbara was not born to this world. She entered life on August 25, 1951, and spent much of her adult years in the rhythms of corporate America, living alongside her husband Carl, who served as the assistant director of worldwide security operations for J.P. Morgan Chase. Theirs was a life shaped by professional ambition, structured schedules, and the particular demands of a high-level financial institution. It was comfortable, purposeful, and thoroughly removed from the wilderness. Carl was a Montana native, born and raised in the small city of Dillon in the state's southwestern corner. For 17 years, he had carried the mountains within him even as he navigated the corridors of power in the banking world. When the couple finally made the decision to leave that world behind and return to the land that Carl had always called home, Barbara was a willing partner, but an uncertain one. Montana's winters are fierce, its winds relentless, its landscape overwhelming. She would need to adapt to an entirely new way of life. In 2001, they settled in Corvallis, a small community of just over 1,000 people tucked in the heart of the Bitterroot Valley. The town sits at roughly 3,600 feet of elevation, surrounded by cottonwood trees along the river bottoms and the jagged silhouette of the Bitterroot Range always visible to the west. Barbara struggled at first with the harshness of the climate, the way the wind could cut through even the warmest clothing, the way the cold arrived early and departed late. She had not anticipated how demanding the landscape could be. But then something changed. Barbara discovered the mountains themselves, not as abstract features of the horizon, but as places to enter, to know, to love. She began hiking, first on the easier trails, then gradually venturing onto more challenging terrain. She took up running. She pushed her small 5-foot frame through miles of valley floor and mountain switchbacks, and somewhere in the process, the land reshaped her. The woman who had once been uncertain about Montana became one of its most devoted residents. She carried a black day pack on her hikes, well stocked with food, water, and first aid essentials. And tucked inside that pack always was a .357 Magnum revolver. This was not a casual choice or a fearful one. It was the practical response of a sensible woman who understood that the wilderness she loved was also home to black bears and mountain lions. Barbara was careful, thorough, and experienced. She knew what she was doing out there. Her favorite trail was the Bear Creek Overlook route, a moderately challenging 2.6-mile hike that ascended above the valley floor and opened onto one of the most spectacular panoramic views in the entire Bitterroot region. Barbara returned to it again and again, sometimes alone, sometimes with friends, always at home on its familiar curves and switchbacks. She knew every loose stone, every shaded stretch, every place where the wind came up suddenly from the valley below. She had become, in the truest sense, a woman of these mountains. Carl had suffered a heart attack that prevented him from joining her on the more demanding hikes, but this never stopped Barbara. She continued to explore with the confidence of someone who has earned her knowledge through years of genuine experience. She was not reckless. She was not naive. She was exactly the kind of person you would want with you if something went wrong in the backcountry. By the summer of 2007, Barbara and Carl had been in Corvallis for 6 years. They had built a life there, found their rhythms, become part of the community. Barbara had recently taken up flying lessons, drawn as always toward new challenges and new ways of seeing the landscape she loved. They were planning a trip to the Mexican Riviera in the fall. There was, by every account from those who knew them, nothing wrong, nothing missing, nothing that would explain what was about to happen. Part 2. The morning of July 18th, 2007. The day that would alter everything began ordinarily enough. Carl's cousin Donna Biles had arrived from California for a visit, accompanied by her boyfriend, a 58-year-old man named Jim Ramaker. The previous evening, the group had gathered for dinner and drinks, relaxing into the easy rhythms of a summer visit. Laughter, conversation, frozen drinks, the kind of evening that leaves everyone slightly flushed and satisfied and reluctant to wake early the next morning. Barbara had planned a group hike to the Bear Creek Overlook for Wednesday morning. It was, as always, the first thing she wanted to show visitors, the trail she loved most, the view that had captivated her from the moment she first reached the overlook and looked out across the valley. She wanted Jim and Donna to see what she saw when she stood up there among the peaks. But when Wednesday arrived, Donna was suffering from the aftermath of the previous night's indulgences. She was not feeling well, certainly not well enough for a 2.6-mile hike at elevation. The plan shifted. Barbara suggested that she and Jim go alone, and the adjustment seemed straightforward enough. Carl was still sleeping when Barbara came to his room to let him know about the change. The last words he would ever hear from his wife were gentle and domestic. She told him not to worry about dinner. She would take care of it when she got back. "I'll see you a little later," she said. She walked out the door somewhere between 8:30 and 9 o'clock in the morning. She was wearing a pastel-colored shirt and tan shorts, and she carried her familiar black day pack, the .357 Magnum, inside it. She was in good spirits, looking forward to sharing the view that had meant so much to her. The drive from Corvallis to the Bear Creek trailhead takes roughly 15 minutes. Barbara knew every mile of it, but when they arrived at the turnoff for the access road, they encountered an unexpected obstacle. The Forest Service was replacing a culvert, and the road was closed approximately a mile from the trailhead. A construction crew was already hard at work when Barbara and Jim arrived and parked Jim's rental car alongside the closure sign. Also parked at the closure sign was another vehicle, a light-colored, older model Chevrolet S10 or similar Blazer-style SUV with Missoula County license plates. The construction workers had noted it when they arrived. Two young men in their early 20s, one described as dark-skinned with dark hair, the other with fair skin and reddish hair, both in excellent physical condition, had apparently already passed through the construction zone and were somewhere on the trail above. They had a dog with them, a black mixed breed with floppy ears and white markings. Barbara and Jim made their way through the work zone and began their ascent. The trail wound upward through pine forest and across stretches of loose shale that crunched and shifted underfoot. It was a clear day, the kind of morning that makes the Bitterroot seem more vivid than usual. The air sharp and clean at elevation, the valley laid out below in long green sweeps. For Barbara, this was as familiar as her own backyard. For Jim, it was a revelation. At the overlook, they encountered the two young men with their dog. According to Jim's later account, the four of them spent approximately 30 minutes together at the viewpoint, chatting about the scenery and taking in the view. There was nothing unusual about the encounter. It was the ordinary sociability of strangers meeting on a trail, two groups of hikers sharing a spectacular moment before parting ways. The young men and their dog eventually headed back down ahead of Barbara and Jim. After resting and eating snacks at the overlook, Barbara and Jim began their own descent. The time was approximately 11:30 in the morning. They were heading back toward the trailhead, the familiar trail unrolling downward before them. Jim stopped to look back at the view one final time. He would later tell investigators that he paused for no more than 30 to 45 seconds. Barbara was walking ahead of him, approximately 20 to 30 feet further down the trail. He turned for one last look at the mountains. Then he turned back. Barbara was gone. Part 3. An impossible moment. The word gone does inadequate justice to what Jim Ramaker found when he turned back toward the trail. Gone implies a departure. A departure implies movement. Movement implies some chain of events that can be traced, however faintly. But Barbara Bolick left no trace of departure whatsoever. She was not partially hidden by trees. She was not around the next bend. She was not anywhere. Jim called out her name. His voice carried through the pine forest, and there was no answer. He called again. The silence was absolute. Not the comfortable quiet of a peaceful landscape, but the heavy, unnatural silence of a question with no answer. On a trail covered with loose shale, movement makes noise. Every step shifts stone, every footfall announces itself. And yet Jim had heard nothing at all during the 30 to 45 seconds he spent looking at the view. No footsteps running off the trail. No sound of a stumble or fall. No cry for help. No sound of any kind. He searched the immediate area, pushing through the underbrush at the trail's edge, looking behind boulders and trees, scanning the slope above and below. Nothing. He expanded his search, venturing further from the trail in widening circles, still calling her name. The terrain around the Bear Creek Overlook is not a dense jungle where a person could be 5 feet away and invisible. It is relatively open pine forest with good sight lines in most directions. There were few places where someone could step off the trail and disappear from view in under a minute. After approximately 20 to 30 minutes of searching alone, Jim made the difficult walk back to the trailhead. When he reached the construction area, he immediately approached the work crew and described Barbara, asking if anyone had seen her pass through. No one had. The crew confirmed, crucially, that the 2 young men with the dog had already left before Jim came down alone asking about his missing hiking companion. Back in Corvallis, Carl Bolick was at work on a carpentry project when his cousin Donna began to express her worry. Noon had come and gone. There was still no word. Carl attempted to reassure her. Barbara often lost track of time on the trails, he said. She was experienced and capable. There was nothing to worry about. The phone call came in the early afternoon. A Forest Service law enforcement officer was on the line. He asked whether Carl's wife was named Barbara. Carl's stomach dropped. His first instinct, even then, was denial. He refused to believe that his wife, his careful, trail-hardened wife, could be missing from a hike she had done dozens of times. BS was essentially his first response. If anyone was lost, he thought, it was the hiking companion. He drove immediately to the Bear Creek Overlook area. By the time he arrived, search efforts were already underway. But there was no Barbara. There was no explanation. There was only the mountain and the silence, and a question that was already beginning to deepen towards something far more troubling than a lost hiker case. Part 4. The machinery of a search. The search operation that followed Barbara's disappearance grew quickly from a standard lost hiker response into one of the most extensive search operations in Montana history. Within hours, multiple agencies were coordinating resources across the rugged terrain surrounding Bear Creek Overlook. Ravalli County Search and Rescue mobilized immediately, deploying ground teams to cover the immediate area. Missoula County Search and Rescue joined the effort. Local law enforcement from both counties worked alongside Forest Service officers who knew the terrain intimately. Volunteers from the broader community arrived in growing numbers. The Montana Air National Guard contributed a helicopter equipped with both infrared and thermal imaging capabilities. The Department of Homeland Security also participated, extending the search's reach beyond what local agencies could manage alone. Search dogs were brought in, highly trained tracking animals whose abilities have solved countless missing person cases in every kind of terrain. These dogs can follow scent trails that are days old, detect human presence through rock and water, pick up traces that human investigators would never find. They were given Barbara's scent and set loose to find her. They found nothing. This was perhaps the single most troubling detail in the entire investigation. Even if Barbara had been injured, even if she had crawled some distance from the trail before losing consciousness, the dogs should have been able to find her. Their failure to pick up any scent whatsoever beyond the last known point of contact did not simply mean that Barbara had wandered off undetected. It meant something far more unsettling. Something had happened to her that left no detectable trace for some of the most sensitive noses on Earth to follow. Ground teams searched ravines and gullies. They looked for evidence of falls and slides, disturbed vegetation, scraped rock surfaces, signs that a body had traveled down a slope. They examined every creek bed and drainage in the area, every shadowed recess where a person who had fallen might lie, unable to call for help. The searches continued for weeks, covering not just the immediate area, but expanding into vast swaths of surrounding wilderness. After 2 weeks of intensive searching, 19 separate search missions in total, Sheriff Chris Hoffman made a sobering statement to the press. "We are perplexed," he said. "We have combed the area in the vicinity of the disappearance very well. No trace at all has been found." Lead investigator Perry Johnson was more direct about the challenge. "This whole case challenges our life experience," he said. "Whenever we go hiking, we expect that we'll return to our vehicle with our hiking partners. We think nothing about it. That's just the way it is." Only this time it wasn't. Carl Bolick stayed at the Bear Creek Overlook until midnight on the first night, refusing to leave the area where his wife had last been seen. Search teams eventually persuaded him to go home and rest. He returned the following day with friends and neighbors, and the day after that, and the day after that. He could not stop searching. He could not stop believing that somewhere in those mountains, there was an answer waiting to be found. Part 5. The two young men who never came forward. As the initial shock gave way to a longer, grimmer investigation, certain details crystallized as particularly significant. Among the most puzzling was the continued silence of the two young men who had been on the Bear Creek Overlook trail that morning. By every account, from the construction workers who had seen them at the roadblock, from Jim Ramaker's description of their time at the Overlook, these men were the only independent witnesses who could confirm that Barbara Bolick had actually been on the mountain that day. Without their testimony, investigators were relying entirely on Jim's account. The young men had seen Barbara. They had spoken with her at the Overlook. They could place her on that trail at that specific time. Their information was not merely useful. It was potentially essential. Their description was detailed. They were in their early 20s. One had dark skin and dark black hair. The other had a lighter complexion and distinctly reddish hair. Both appeared to be in excellent athletic condition. They had a black mixed breed dog with floppy ears and white markings. Their vehicle was described as a light-colored, older model Chevrolet S10 or similar SUV with Missoula County license plates. The Missoula County plates were significant. They suggested local residents, people who would almost certainly have been aware of the massive search operation and extensive media coverage that followed Barbara's disappearance. Montana is a large state in geography, but not in population. News of a woman vanishing without a trace from a well-known hiking trail would have been hard to miss, particularly for people who lived nearby. And yet the weeks passed, and neither man came forward. The media coverage intensified. Barbara's face appeared on television screens and in newspapers across the region. Law enforcement made repeated public appeals. The sheriff's department issued detailed descriptions of the two witnesses and explicitly stated they were not suspects, only people whose information could be crucial to understanding what had happened. Barbara's family took the extraordinary step of offering a $10,000 reward specifically for information leading to the identification of these two men. As Perry Johnson noted with evident frustration, this was unprecedented in his experience. A substantial cash reward offered not to catch a suspect, but simply to locate witnesses. "This is the first time that we've had a $10,000 reward offered to help us locate a witness," he said. "The person who helps us locate them will get $10,000. The reward went unclaimed. The men never came forward. This silence has never been adequately explained. It is possible, though difficult to believe, that they were simply unaware of the search. It is possible they witnessed something that day which they feared would implicate them, despite investigators' explicit assurances to the contrary. It is possible they saw nothing useful and simply did not realize their testimony was the one piece of independent corroboration that investigators desperately needed. But their absence from the investigation remains one of its most nagging loose threads. Law enforcement sketches of one of the men were released and widely distributed. The $10,000 reward generated tips, but none that led to identification. 17 years later, the identities of the two young men with the dog remain unknown. The question of what they saw and what they know has never been answered. Part 6. The Theories, a catalog of the inexplicable. When a person disappears without a trace, the human mind rushes to construct explanations. This is not merely morbid curiosity. It is the fundamental need to impose meaning on events that seem to defy it. In the case of Barbara Bolick, the theories have proliferated and evolved over 17 years, and not one of them is entirely satisfying. The accident theory. The most straightforward explanation is that Barbara suffered some kind of physical accident, a fall, a medical emergency, some sudden crisis. The Bear Creek Overlook trail includes areas of loose shale and steep terrain, and even experienced hikers can be caught off guard. But this theory has always struggled against the evidence. Barbara had a known fear of heights, which made her instinctively cautious near cliff edges and steep drop-offs. She knew this trail with the intimacy that comes from having walked it dozens of times. More critically, the loose shale makes any kind of rapid movement distinctly audible. It shifts and crunches with every step in a way that would have been clearly perceptible to Jim Ramaker just 30 feet away. He heard nothing. And then there are the search dogs. If Barbara had fallen somewhere nearby, the tracking dogs should have found her. Their complete failure to pick up any scent is extremely difficult to reconcile with the accident theory. No physical evidence of an accident was ever found. No drag marks, no disturbed vegetation, no blood, no clothing fragments. In 17 years of searches by professional teams, search dogs, hunters, and hikers who regularly traverse the area, not a single trace of Barbara or her belongings has ever been located. The animal attack theory. Montana is bear and mountain lion country. Barbara carried her .357 Magnum specifically because she understood this danger. The possibility of a predator attack cannot be entirely dismissed. But against this theory stands the complete absence of any physical evidence. A bear or mountain lion attack leaves marks, blood, tissue, disturbed ground, dragged trails. Investigators found none of this. Moreover, predator attacks are not silent affairs. Jim Ramaker was 30 feet away and heard absolutely nothing. Additionally, in the decades since the disappearance, hunters and hikers have ranged extensively through the surrounding terrain. No remains, no clothing, no equipment of any kind has ever been found. The wilderness does not consume its dead so completely as to leave nothing behind for nearly 2 decades. The foul play theory. As the last person to see Barbara alive, Jim Ramaker inevitably faced scrutiny. His account of events was unusual, and the circumstances of the disappearance were strange enough that some people were unwilling to take his story entirely at face value. Some theorists suggested that Jim might have made unwanted advances during the hike, leading to a confrontation with consequences he then had to conceal. However, the investigation found no evidence to support these theories. Jim had no apparent motive to harm Barbara. He had cooperated fully from the beginning, offered to take a polygraph test, and maintained contact with the department over the years that followed. Lead investigator Perry Johnson was consistent and explicit in his assessment. "I want to be fair to Jim Ramaker," Johnson said. "There's no evidence he did anything to Barbara. He's been cooperative and returned all of our calls. He stayed in contact with us. Until something else happens, we find Barbara or find her body, I think he's just a witness." Jim himself said plainly, "I never laid a hand on Barbara. I never harmed her in any way." He acknowledged living with a cloud over his head since 2007. the inevitable consequence of being the last known person to see someone who then vanished without explanation. The third-party involvement theory. Could someone else have been present on the trail that day, watching and waiting for an opportunity? Could Barbara have been abducted by a person whose presence was entirely unknown to Jim? The problem is the same one that dogs every theory: the terrain and the timeline. The loose shale would have made any approach audible. The relatively open forest provided limited cover for rapid, undetected movement. Barbara was armed with a .357 Magnum and would not have been an easy victim. She almost certainly would have drawn the weapon and called for help before being subdued. Jim was just 30 feet away. Any struggle should have been audible. Investigators found no evidence of a third party. No tracks, no disturbed vegetation, no tire marks near the trail. The voluntary disappearance theory. As months passed, and then years, some people began to wonder whether Barbara might have staged her own disappearance to start new life elsewhere. Barbara Bolick rejected this with the certainty of a man who had known his wife for 14 years. Barbara had left behind all of her identification documents and her wallet. Her bank accounts remained completely untouched in the years that followed. She had been excited about her flying lessons and the Mexico trip they had planned together. And above everything else, she would never have abandoned her beloved dog, an animal that had attached itself to her at a gun show and that she cherished deeply. She wouldn't have left without her beloved dog, Carl said. The simplicity of the statement contained its own weight of conviction. Part 7. The missing 411 phenomenon and the wider pattern. In the years that followed Barbara's disappearance, her case became associated with a broader and deeply controversial phenomenon. The missing 411 cases documented by David Paulides, a former law enforcement officer turned researcher who has compiled what he believes to be a pattern of unusual wilderness disappearances across North America. Paulides cataloged hundreds of cases that he argued shared certain characteristics. Disappearances under conditions that seemed physically unlikely, the inability of search dogs to track the missing person, the absence of any physical trace despite extensive searches, and the apparent impossibility of the vanishing itself, given the terrain and circumstances. He was careful not to ascribe specific causes to these disappearances, but the cumulative weight of the cases he documented suggested, in his view, that something was happening in America's wilderness areas that conventional explanations could not fully account for. Barbara Bolick's case fits the pattern Paulides described in almost every particular. She was an experienced outdoorswoman who vanished from familiar terrain under clear weather conditions. Search dogs could find no trace of her scent. No physical evidence was ever recovered. The timing of the disappearance defied easy explanation given the presence of a witness just 30 feet away. And the case has never been solved despite nearly 2 decades of active investigation. Paulides himself examined the Bolick case and interviewed Jim Ramaker. His assessment was characteristically cautious. Some people believe it's pure criminal. I haven't formed an opinion. That careful neutrality reflects the honest difficulty of the case. Even someone who has studied more unusual wilderness disappearances than perhaps anyone alive found Barbara Bolick's story too complex to categorize. It should be emphasized that the missing 411 phenomenon remains deeply contested. Skeptics argue that Paulides engages in selective presentation of data, cherry-picking cases that fit an implied narrative while ignoring the much larger number of wilderness disappearances that are resolved conventionally. They point out that wilderness disappearances are genuinely common, that their circumstances often seem unusual when viewed in isolation, and that the apparent pattern may be an artifact of how the cases are chosen and described rather than evidence of anything genuinely anomalous. What is not contested is that Barbara Bolick's case is genuinely unusual, not because of any supernatural element, but because the straightforward physical facts of her disappearance are extraordinarily difficult to reconcile with any ordinary explanation. Part 8. The human cost. Statistics about missing persons cases tend to abstract the individuals they describe, reducing complex human lives to data points in a database. The Bolick case was, in the most fundamental sense, not a statistics problem. It was the destruction of a family and the theft of a life. Carl Bolick had spent 17 years with Barbara. They had built a career together, made the decision to change their lives, moved across the country to the mountains Carl had always loved. They had made Barbara's transformation from uncertain corporate spouse to passionate mountain woman into a shared project and a shared joy. And then, on an ordinary July morning, she walked out the door and never came back. Carl spent the rest of his life searching for answers. From his kitchen table in Corvallis, he could look across the Bitterroot Valley toward the mountains where his wife had vanished. The view that had once represented everything they had built together became a daily reminder of everything he did not know and might never know. He returned to the Bear Creek Overlook again and again, walking the trail, studying the terrain, trying to find some detail that the professional searchers had missed. "I just couldn't accept it," he said. "I just knew that she was going to show up one way or another, but it didn't happen. It still hasn't happened." The disappearance also fractured the extended family. Carl's cousin Donna later suggested to other family members that Barbara might have died by suicide. The suggestion enraged Carl, who found it not only unfounded, but deeply disrespectful of his wife's memory and character. He refused to speak to either Donna or Jim Ramaker again. The rift was permanent. This kind of secondary fracturing is a documented consequence of unresolved disappearances. The uncertainty itself becomes a toxic presence that corrodes relationships, generates blame, and leaves every surviving family member trapped in a state of suspended grief. You cannot properly mourn someone who has not been declared dead. You cannot achieve closure when closure has no foundation. You can only wait and search and wonder. Carl Bolick passed away in 2021, 14 years after Barbara's disappearance. He never found the closure he sought. He died not knowing what happened to his wife on the trail she loved most, in the mountains that had given both of them a new life. The broader community of the Bitterroot Valley was deeply affected as well. Barbara was not just a private person. She was an active presence, known to her neighbors and fellow hikers, someone who had made the valley her own through 6 years of enthusiastic engagement with its landscape and people. Her disappearance sent a chill through the local hiking community, a reminder that the mountains that seem so familiar and so welcoming can, under some circumstances, simply take a person and give nothing back. Part 9. The investigation that never ended. The Ravalli County Sheriff's Office has never closed the Barbara Bolick case. In 2023, 16 years after her disappearance, law enforcement issued new public appeals for information, renewing their request for anything that anyone might know about what happened at Bear Creek Overlook on July 18, 2007. The case file remains active. The financial cost of the investigation has been substantial. U.S. Attorney Jesse Laslovich described the apparatus that mobilizes when someone disappears. Local law enforcement, state agencies, federal authorities, volunteer search and rescue organizations, specialized equipment, and the ongoing human hours that investigators continue to devote to cold cases. It's hundreds and thousands of dollars, just in hours that are put into it, he said. But Laslovich was emphatic that the investment was justified and would continue regardless of cost. Is it worth it? Of course. Do we track the money that is spent and say, okay, we've reached this point and we're not going to investigate anymore? No. Our job is to actually get to the truth and to hold people accountable for any crime, but particularly when there's a missing person. Perry Johnson, who served as lead investigator for years, never wavered in his belief that finding the two young men was the key to understanding what happened. He acknowledged the uncomfortable reality. Ramaker is the only source that Barbara Bolick was up there that day. Without independent confirmation that Barbara had even reached the Overlook, the case rested on a single witness's account with nothing to corroborate or contradict it. These guys are the key to the whole thing, Johnson said of the unidentified witnesses. I don't suspect them of doing anything wrong. I don't think they were even in the wrong place at the wrong time. What the men can do is confirm that Barbara Bolick was there that morning. Right now, I don't have a witness to confirm or conflict with the information we've gathered so far. As of 2025, if Barbara Bolick is still alive, she would be 73 years old. Given the passage of time, that possibility grows increasingly remote with each year. But the case remains technically open, and investigators continue to assert that they will follow any new information wherever it leads. Former news director Jim Harmon put it simply: they were only a short distance apart. Yet in a few seconds, he looks back and she's not there. It's just amazing to me. How in the world did that happen? How could she not just have been a short distance down the hill? It's absolutely a mystery. Part 10. What the Mountain Keeps. There is a peculiar kind of grief that attaches itself to unsolved disappearances, different in character from the grief of confirmed death. When someone dies, the mourning is terrible, but it has edges, a shape that the mind can eventually learn to contain. When someone simply vanishes, the mourning has no edges at all. It spreads outward indefinitely, touching everything, because the absence has never been fully confirmed, the story has never properly ended, and the imagination, that unreliable, unstoppable mechanism, keeps reaching toward explanations that reality stubbornly refuses to provide. Barbara Bolick has been missing for nearly 18 years. In that time, the Bitterroot Valley has changed and not changed. The mountains look exactly as they did on July 18, 2007. The Bear Creek Overlook Trail still winds upward through pine forest to the same spectacular view that Barbara loved and shared with every visitor she could persuade to make the hike. Hikers still park at the trailhead and walk the 2.6 miles to the overlook, and most of them know nothing about what happened there on a clear July morning almost 2 decades ago. Those who do know carry the case with them like a stone in the pocket, a small, constant weight that reminds them that the familiar landscape can harbor the utterly inexplicable. How does a person walk 25 feet ahead of her companion on a trail she has walked dozens of times, in full daylight, on clear terrain, and simply cease to exist? How does an experienced hiker armed with a pistol leave no trace whatsoever? No scent, no physical evidence, no indication that she was ever there, despite the best efforts of sophisticated search technology and skilled tracking dogs. The honest answer, uncomfortable as it is that nobody knows. Every theory has significant problems. Every explanation that seems almost adequate falls apart under examination. The case confronts us with the possibility that sometimes things happen that we cannot explain with the tools and frameworks we have available, and that this is not merely a failure of investigation, but something more fundamental and more troubling. What we know for certain is this: Barbara Bolick was a real woman, a woman who transformed herself in middle age and discovered a passion for the mountains that she carried with her every day of the 6 years she spent in the Bitterroot Valley. She was careful and capable and loved. She walked in the mountains on an ordinary morning and did not come home. Her husband spent the rest of his life waiting for an answer that never arrived. And somewhere in the wilderness of western Montana, if the mountains have not consumed her completely, there may still be some small trace of what happened, a clue that the right pair of eyes might one day recognize for what it is. The Ravalli County Sheriff's Office continues to carry the case in their active files. Barbara is listed in the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System as Case MP 12518. Anyone with information about her disappearance, about the 2 young men with the dog, or about any aspect of that July morning in 2007 is urged to contact the Ravalli County Sheriff's Office at 406-375-4061. Somewhere, someone knows something about what happened at Bear Creek Overlook on July 18, 2007. That someone has lived with that knowledge for 18 years. It is not too late to speak. Epilogue. A description worth remembering. Barbara Bolick was born August 25, 1951. At the time of her disappearance, she was 55 years old. She stood 5 feet tall and weighed approximately 115 pounds. She had auburn, shoulder-length hair and brown eyes. Her ears were pierced. She was last seen wearing a pastel-colored shirt and tan shorts, carrying a black day pack that contained, among other items, a .357 Magnum revolver. The two unidentified male hikers on the Bear Creek Overlook trail that morning were described as being in their early 20s. One was dark-skinned with dark, black hair. The other had a medium complexion and reddish hair. Both appear to be in excellent physical condition with athletic builds. They were accompanied by a black mixed-breed dog with floppy ears and white markings. Their vehicle was described as a light-colored, older model Chevrolet S10 or similar SUV with Missoula County, Montana license plates. The family of Barbara Bolick offered a $10,000 reward for information leading to the identification of these witnesses. That reward was never claimed. The Ravalli County Sheriff's Office may be reached at 406-375-4061. The NamUs case number for Barbara Bolick is MP 12518.